In the vast setting of the ancient world, few battles were capable of shaping the course of history as much as the Battle of Gaugamela. Fought on the first day of October in the year 331 before Christ, on an open plain in Mesopotamia, this confrontation brought face-to-face two worlds. On one side, the Macedonian Empire, led by a young man who had already proven his military genius, Alexander, and on the other, the greatest empire the planet had known up to that point, the Persia of Darius III, with its immense ranks of soldiers coming from the most diverse provinces. This battle was not just another clash between armies, but a turning point in world history, as it represented the moment when the balance of power tipped definitively toward the Greek side, bringing down centuries of Persian supremacy in the east and opening the way for the expansion of Hellenistic culture over regions that for a long time had been under the control of Eastern kings. The importance of this confrontation goes far beyond the victory of a smaller army against an enemy that was numerically superior. Gaugamela is remembered as the setting where strategic intelligence triumphed over brute force. It was there that Alexander showed the world that war was not won merely by numbers, but by studying the terrain, enforcing strict discipline among the troops, and using a unique ability to see beyond what the enemy could anticipate. On a field carefully chosen by Darius to favor the vast Persian ranks and their war chariots, Alexander reversed the logic of inferiority, and with precise maneuvers, transformed an adverse terrain into an opportunity. This battle is also a reflection of the meeting of cultures. Until that moment, the Persian Empire had been the center of a vast, multilingual and plural civilization, dominating from Central Asia to the gates of Egypt. Alexander, on the other hand, came from the military tradition of Macedonia, forged by his father Philip II, and refined through years of training under the guidance of masters like Aristotle. At Gaugamela, two worlds collided, the multicultural and consolidated East against the rising West, which sought to prove that its way of waging war and ruling could be more efficient and lasting. This collision would forever change the political, economic, and cultural direction of the ancient world. With his victory, Alexander did not merely defeat an enemy. He destroyed a centuries-old model of power, giving rise to an entirely new period. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, legendary cities and centers of Eastern power, opened their gates to the conqueror. After Gaugamela, the line that separated the Greek and Persian worlds virtually disappeared, giving birth to what we now call Hellenism, a fusion of customs, traditions, and knowledge that would spread across all of Western Asia. For this reason, every time history mentions Gaugamela, it speaks of much more than a battle. It speaks of the moment when a young man of only 25 years changed the balance of the world, becoming the master of the destiny of entire peoples. This introduction leads us to understand why Gaugamela is considered, even today, one of the greatest examples of the art of war. It is not merely about remembering how a small army defeated another that was infinitely larger. It is about examining the causes, the choices, the strategies, and the consequences of a confrontation that rewrote the political history of the planet. And throughout this script, we will delve into all these aspects, understanding how the battlefield of that morning became the stage for a transformation so immense that it still echoes more than 2,000 years later. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Gaugamela, it is necessary to look back at the decades that preceded this confrontation and analyze the political chessboard that shaped the ancient world. For a long time, Greece was made up of independent city-states such as Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth, which lived in a constant state of both alliances and conflicts. While these small urban centers prospered culturally and militarily around the Mediterranean, Persia, under powerful dynasties, built one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, with territories that extended from the Indus Valley in the present-day Asian region to the coast of Asia Minor reaching Egypt and the Black Sea. This enormous difference in scale made Greece appear as a mosaic of small regional powers when compared to an Eastern colossus. Since the 5th century before Christ, these two civilizations clashed in a series of confrontations that became known as the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persians, under the command of kings such as Darius I and Xerxes, attempted to dominate the Greek cities in campaigns that included legendary battles such as Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. On those occasions, the Greeks proved that, united and well organized, they could withstand an enemy far more numerous. This resistance forged a spirit of military superiority that remained alive among the Hellenes and inspired later generations, including that of Philip II and his son Alexander. Although the Persian invasions had failed, the Greeks never forgot the constant threat from the east, and the rivalry between the two cultures grew like an open wound. After these wars, Greece plunged into internal conflicts, especially the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which weakened everyone. This weakening created the opportunity for a new power to rise: Macedonia. Under the rule of Philip II, Macedonia ceased to be regarded as a barbarian region by the great Greek cities and became a highly militarized kingdom with a disciplined army and new combat tactics. Philip dreamed of unifying the Greeks under his leadership and leading them in a great war against the Persians as an act of revenge and expansion. His premature death prevented him from carrying out this plan, but it left an extremely well-trained army in the hands of a young prince who inherited not only power, but also ambition. On the other side of this chessboard was the Persian Empire, which had reached its peak of wealth but was beginning to show signs of internal decay. Darius III inherited a vast territory that was difficult to govern, with diverse peoples and constant tensions on its borders. Despite having access to an almost unlimited number of soldiers and resources, the cohesion of the empire was weakened, and the Persian court no longer possessed the discipline and political strength of its predecessors. This fragility was not visible to the naked eye to the rest of the world, but it was present, and Alexander knew how to exploit it masterfully. When Alexander ascended the throne of Macedonia, he inherited his father's dream: to lead the Greek armies beyond the mountains and confront Persia on its own soil. After consolidating his control over the Greek city-states, he crossed the Hellespont and within a few years won two impressive battles: the Battle of the Granicus River and the Battle of Issus. These victories made Alexander not only a real military threat, but an unbeatable strategist. Darius, seeing his western territories fall one after another, realized that he needed to give a definitive response. And so, pressured by the fast and daring advance of the young king, he gathered all the forces he still possessed, coming from every part of the empire to face the invader one last time. The place chosen for this confrontation would be an open plain near a small village called Gaugamela. The meeting at Gaugamela, therefore, did not happen by chance. It was the culmination of centuries of rivalry between two distinct ways of viewing the world. On one side, the colossal, wealthy and multicultural empire that represented the tradition of the East. On the other, a young king and his small but highly disciplined army who carried the spirit of a united Greece under a single command. This confrontation was not only military, it was ideological. It represented the dispute over which civilization would have the right to impose its influence and culture over the entire known world. To understand the genius that revealed itself at Gaugamela, it is necessary to go back to the beginning of Alexander's life, a figure whose upbringing combined military, cultural and philosophical elements in a way that has rarely been repeated in history. Alexander was born in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, in the year 356 before Christ. His father, Philip II, was a king who transformed Macedonia from a territory considered backward by the Greeks into a military power, while his mother, Olympias, was an educated and deeply religious woman who instilled in her son the idea that he possessed an extraordinary destiny. From a very young age, Alexander grew up surrounded by the belief that he was destined for great achievements, listening to stories of heroes such as Achilles and Heracles, and being encouraged to believe that his blood carried something divine. His father, recognizing his son's potential, brought to his education the greatest philosopher of the period, Aristotle. Under this master's guidance, Alexander was exposed to philosophy, science, literature, politics, and ethics, learning to see the world beyond war. This shaped a curious, disciplined, and ambitious character. At the same time, his practical formation was built in the training fields, observing the Macedonian army during real maneuvers and accompanying his father on military campaigns from an early age. Still in his teens, he demonstrated leadership, courage, and strategic intelligence that astonished even experienced generals. At the age of 16, when Philip left for a campaign, he entrusted young Alexander with the government, and Alexander managed to suppress a revolt and even found a city, proving that he was already prepared for adult responsibilities. Alexander's temperament was marked by an uncommon ambition. He was not content with being just a king. Inspired by his studies, he sought to equal the mythological heroes and the great leaders of the past. His time with Aristotle gave him a cosmopolitan vision. To him, the world was a stage where he could unite different peoples under a single ideal. Thus, when his father was assassinated and he ascended the throne at only 20 years old, Alexander already possessed a clarity of purpose that few kings have ever reached: to take Greek civilization beyond the Aegean Sea, subdue Persia, and fuse cultures, creating a universal empire. Early in his reign, he had to prove his authority. Rebellions and internal threats arose, and he responded with speed and determination, consolidating his power throughout Greece. After that, he turned his attention to Persia, the ultimate goal he had inherited from Philip. With an army small in number but disciplined and well-trained, he crossed the Hellespont in a bold military campaign that would change the course of history. He defeated the Persians at the Granicus River, and later at the Battle of Issus, where he defeated Darius III for the first time, forcing him to flee the battlefield and leaving behind his own family. Each victory increased Alexander's confidence and reputation. He was not only a commander, he was a strategist who knew how to combine boldness with meticulous planning. While other generals feared being surrounded by much larger forces, Alexander saw opportunities. He had the ability to predict the enemy's movements and exploit weaknesses as if he were always several steps ahead. This skill became evident in all his campaigns, but it reached its highest expression at Gaugamela, where he faced not only a gigantic army, but also a battlefield chosen specifically to favor his adversary. Behind his ambition, there was also a deep desire to leave a lasting legacy. Alexander was not only seeking military victories, he wanted to build an empire that united East and West. In his character coexisted the hardness of a warrior and the vision of a civilizing leader. With every new city he founded, and every territory he conquered, he sought to introduce elements of Greek culture, but also adopted customs and practices from the peoples he subdued, creating a style of government that broke down barriers. This universal ambition is one of the reasons why his name is still remembered today as one of the greatest in history. Thus, when he arrived at Gaugamela, Alexander was not just a 25-year-old leading an army. He was a man shaped by years of intellectual, military, and emotional preparation, someone who carried within himself the strength of the Macedonian tradition and the desire to transform the world into something greater than the limits he had known in his youth. And on that battlefield, all these elements would come together to write one of the most remarkable chapters in ancient history. To understand the colossal challenge that Alexander faced at Gaugamela, it is essential to understand who Darius III was and what the Persian Empire represented at that time. Darius III, also known as Gaugamela before ascending to the throne, was a Persian noble who rose to power during a critical period when the largest empire in the world was beginning to show cracks in its structure. Even so, upon taking the crown, he still ruled over an unprecedented expanse of territory, a realm that stretched from Libya and Egypt to the frontiers of India, passing through Mesopotamia, Persia, Asia Minor, the Caucasus, and the plains of Central Asia. The wealth of this empire was legendary, sustained by trade routes that crossed deserts and seas and controlled almost the entire flow of precious goods in antiquity. The organization of the Persian Empire was based on satrapies, provinces governed by satraps who had administrative and military autonomy but owed loyalty to the great king. This decentralization allowed for effective administration over such vast territories, but also created vulnerabilities, since each region maintained local armies, distinct cultures, and, at times, internal rivalries. When Darius III ascended the throne, he had to deal with revolts in some of these regions and consolidate power quickly. Despite these difficulties, the empire remained powerful and capable of gathering unimaginable forces, especially when the threat was external. Darius III was not an inexperienced or passive ruler. Ancient accounts describe him as a courageous man with a strong presence, determined to restore the honor of the empire his predecessors had built. He knew that Alexander represented a danger, unlike any previous adversary. The Macedonian victories at the Granicus and Issus had shaken the confidence of the Persian troops and undermined the prestige of the throne. Therefore, after these defeats, Darius began to prepare a definitive response. His objective was to crush Alexander in an open battle, using the immense numerical superiority of his army to eliminate once and for all the threat rising from the west. To achieve this, Darius mobilized contingents from nearly every part of the empire. Soldiers from Babylonia, Media, Caria, Egypt, Syria, and even Indian and Scythian mercenaries were summoned. His army included war chariots equipped with blades on their wheels to cut through enemy lines, as well as heavy cavalry and numerous infantry. Some ancient accounts even mention elephants brought from India, something rare in battles of that period. This military force represented not only brute strength, but also a spectacle of cultural and military diversity. When the Persian forces gathered, they resembled an ocean in motion, something that by itself could shake the morale of any opponent. On the eve of the Battle of Gaugamela, Darius made an important strategic decision. He chose flat, open terrain, wide enough to allow the movement of his numerous troops, and most importantly, his war chariots. He ordered the ground to be carefully prepared, removing irregularities to create a perfect arena for a frontal assault. The idea was simple: use numerical superiority to surround and crush the Macedonian army, cutting off every escape route. Confident in his advantage, he believed that Alexander would have no way to escape or hold out for long. Darius's confidence came not only from the size of his army, but also from the tradition of power that he embodied. For over 2 centuries, the Persian kings had commanded respect and fear across all the peoples of the East. Entire cities trembled at the mere sound of the imperial forces approaching. It was a power upheld both by military might and by its symbolic grandeur. However, this confidence turned into overconfidence. Darius believed that the Battle of Gaugamela would be just another chapter in a long series of Persian victories, but what he did not know was that his enemy carried a military mind that would change the course of events within a few hours. Thus, when the sun rose on the morning of the battle, the Persian Empire stood there in its entirety. Thousands of soldiers from different peoples formed a sea of spears, banners, and chariots that seemed unstoppable. On the other side, a young king of only 25 years with a smaller but united army looked at that colossal force, knowing that what lay ahead would determine not only victory, but the future of his ambition to unite the world under a new ideal. Before the plain of Gaugamela was chosen as the stage for the most decisive battle of all, 2 victories had already turned Alexander into a real threat to the Persians: the battles of the Granicus River and Issus. These confrontations not only opened the gates of the Persian Empire to the young Macedonian king, but also created a wave of fear that spread even to the court of Darius III, forcing the monarch to gather all his forces for a final confrontation. In the year 334 before Christ, at the very beginning of his campaign in Asia, Alexander crossed the Hellespont and faced the Persian satraps at the Battle of the Granicus River. At that moment his army was small, about 40,000 men, while the Persians had assembled a larger force composed of cavalry and Greek mercenaries hired to block the Macedonian advance. Instead of being intimidated, Alexander crossed the river in a bold charge, completely disorganizing the enemy lines. His swift strategy and the disciplined use of the Macedonian phalanx opened an irreparable gap, and by the end of the day, the Persian troops were defeated. This victory not only consolidated the Macedonian presence in Asia Minor, but also sent a clear warning. Alexander was not an ordinary invader. The following year, 333 before Christ, came the Battle of Issus, and this confrontation carried an even greater symbolic weight. This time, it was not a group of satraps that Alexander faced, but Darius III himself, commanding a gigantic army. The battle took place in a narrow terrain between the mountains and the sea, which prevented the Persian king from taking full advantage of his numerical superiority. Alexander used this terrain to his advantage, forming a compact line, moving his troops with precision, and opening the way for a devastating attack on the center of the Persian lines. Amid the chaos, Darius lost control of his formation and fled, leaving behind not only his soldiers but also his own family. His wife, daughters, and mother were captured by the Macedonians, an unprecedented humiliation for the King of Kings. Darius's flight at Issus had a devastating psychological impact. For the first time in centuries, the world saw the Persian emperor, the symbol of power and stability, abandon his army and retreat. This defeat opened a dangerous breach, Several regions of the empire began to feel vulnerable and even considered surrender. Babylon, Susa, and other important cities began to waver in their loyalty. At the same time, for Alexander, Issus was more than a military victory. It was proof that he could face and defeat the greatest empire on the planet as long as he knew how to choose the right terrain and the right strategy. This sequence of victories also profoundly changed the way Darius viewed his enemy. If at first he saw Alexander only as a daring and ambitious young man, he now understood that he was facing a strategist capable of turning any disadvantage into victory. Darius tried to negotiate, offering wealth and even the hand of his daughter in marriage in exchange for peace, but Alexander rejected all proposals. For the young king, that was not a time for concessions, but for taking the war deep into the heart of Persia. With Issus, the psychological balance of the war changed completely. Alexander gained absolute confidence in his troops, while Darius felt the weight of the need to restore his honor. Knowing that the empire could begin to collapse at any moment if another defeat were suffered, Darius gathered a colossal number of soldiers from every corner of his provinces and began to carefully prepare the battle that, in his view, would define the fate of the East. This planning culminated in the choice of an open field at Gaugamela, where he believed that numerical superiority would be able to neutralize any trick of the enemy. However, the memory of Issus still haunted the Persian mind. Even in the presence of a sea of soldiers, many officers knew that the man approaching at the head of the Macedonian forces was not an ordinary adversary. He had already proven capable of turning numerical inferiority into victory and possessed a kind of leadership capable of inspiring his soldiers to accomplish almost impossible feats. This tension would become a crucial factor in the behavior of the troops on the day of the battle. With every kilometer that Alexander's army advanced, fear grew in Darius's heart. Defeat would not only mean the loss of a territory, it would mean the end of an era, the collapse of the most powerful empire of antiquity. For that reason, the preparation for Gaugamela became a matter of survival not only for a king but for an entire civilization. After the victory at Issus and the humiliating retreat of Darius III, Alexander knew that the decisive confrontation would not be long in coming. However, between the end of that battle and the arrival at Gaugamela, there was a long interval marked by massive movements, the conquest of cities, and strategic preparation that turned the campaign into a true test of endurance. This path, covered over nearly 2 years, would be essential for consolidating the confidence of the Macedonians and for morally weakening the enemy. After Darius fled, Alexander focused his efforts on conquering the centers of power of the Persian Empire located to the west. He entered legendary cities such as Damascus, Tyre, and Gaza in triumph, facing long and exhausting sieges, especially at Tyre, which lasted 7 months and revealed the young king's determination. At the same time, he marched toward Egypt, where he was received as a liberator by a people weary of Persian rule. There, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria and cemented his image as a sovereign who was not just a warrior, but also a civilizer. These conquests allowed him to secure his supply routes, amass wealth, and strengthen his rear before advancing toward the heart of the Persian Empire. Only after this consolidation did Alexander turn his attention back to Darius. In 331 before Christ, he began a long march toward Mesopotamia, crossing deserts, rivers, and plains, taking with him an army already accustomed to extreme conditions. This journey was a test of endurance for everyone because, even after years of campaigning, Alexander maintained strict discipline within his ranks. No uncontrolled looting, no disobedience. He understood that to face such a numerous enemy, he could not allow any breach in his own organization. On the Persian side during this time, Darius was using these months to prepare the field where he intended to finally defeat Alexander. He chose the plain near Gaugamela, an open and wide terrain that would allow him to make full use of his greatest advantage, numerical superiority and war chariots with blades on their wheels. The ground was carefully leveled to remove any obstacles that might hinder the mobility of his troops. This time, he believed, there would be no surprises. While Alexander came from exhausting marches, Darius was stationed in a field meticulously prepared to annihilate any opposition. The arrival of the Macedonians in Mesopotamia was not sudden. Alexander advanced with careful calculation. Spies and local guides provided him with information about the position and intentions of Darius. He knew he could not afford to be caught off guard, as an ambush could mean the end of the campaign. For this reason, the marches were carried out cautiously, allowing the troops to rest whenever possible, preserving their strength for the inevitable battle. At each stop, he gathered with his officers to draw plans and study reports about the terrain. No step was taken without a clear purpose. When he finally approached the area chosen by Darius, Alexander demonstrated his most remarkable trait: strategic patience. Contrary to what was expected of a young and impetuous warrior, he did not attack immediately. He spent days studying the field, analyzing distances, observing the distribution of the Persian forces, and planning how to turn that disadvantage into an opportunity. Meanwhile, his soldiers, already accustomed to placing complete trust in their commander's judgment, waited calmly, even knowing that the battle that would decide their fate was about to begin. This period of preparation also had an important psychological effect. Darius, upon seeing Alexander standing still in front of his massive force, believed that the enemy was hesitating. This false impression made him even more confident. However, Alexander's calmness was the result of careful analysis, not hesitation. He had already realized that in such open terrain, the key to victory would be to lure the Persians into a movement trap, creating an opening to break through at the most vulnerable point in the enemy's formation. Thus, at the end of September, in the year 331 before Christ, after a long journey that tested the endurance of men and horses, Alexander positioned his army in front of the Persian lines, ready for battle. Before him stood the greatest military force the world had ever assembled. Behind him was the confidence of a man who had won every battle up to that point. Each soldier knew that this field would decide whether they would return home as victors or be swallowed by the greatness of the Persian Empire. The Battle of Gaugamela was about to begin, but for the Macedonians, victory had already been forged during those endless marches, in sweat, discipline, and absolute faith in the man who led them. The choice of the location for a confrontation of this magnitude is never a minor detail, and at Gaugamela, this factor became central to the Persian strategy. After the painful lesson at Issus, where the narrow terrain nullified his numerical advantage, Darius III decided that he would not make the same mistake twice. This time he personally chose a wide, open region near a small locality known as Gaugamela in the heart of Mesopotamia. This area lay northeast of the present-day city of Mosul, on a vast plain with almost no natural obstacles, and it offered unlimited space for the movement of the immense masses of troops he had gathered to annihilate Alexander. The reasoning behind this choice was logical and well-founded. At Issus, the lack of space prevented the Persian army from making use of its own strengths. The ranks were so tightly compressed between the sea and the mountains that the men had no room to maneuver, and numerical superiority became useless. At Gaugamela, in contrast, there were no natural barriers. There, Darius could organize his forces in a wide formation, extending his lines from one end of the horizon to the other, surrounding the Macedonians and employing all the resources of the empire: fast cavalry, war chariots, and infantry from various regions. It was the perfect arena to crush an adversary who was numerically inferior. The care in preparing the terrain was unprecedented, so that the war chariots, equipped with blades on their wheels, could run without obstacles. The Persians had the ground leveled. Stones, ditches, and irregularities were removed, transforming the plain into a smooth field, ideal for the devastating charge of these weapons. This meticulous work was, in Darius's mind, the key that would make any maneuver by Alexander impossible. In an open and clean field, he believed there would be no place for the enemy to hide, and no way to defend against the onslaught of his troops. Another factor that influenced the choice was the control of routes. Gaugamela was strategically located between the cities of Arbela and Nineveh, two important centers in the region. Thus, Darius not only defended a vital position for the heart of the empire, but also maintained nearby and secure supply lines. The Persian army was well-fed, well-rested, and protected by the proximity of its bases, while Alexander came from a long march, weary and in hostile terrain. However, the same plain that seemed to be an advantage also contained risks. Although it offered space for the movement of large masses, it also provided freedom of maneuver to those who had the speed, discipline, and intelligence to exploit every opportunity. Alexander understood this from the first moment he analyzed the region. He knew that he could not face the Persians on equal terms with brute force, but the absence of obstacles would also allow him to execute bold and rapid maneuvers, turning the rigidity of Darius's enormous army into a vulnerability. While the Persian forces occupied kilometers of the horizon, creating an apparently impenetrable human wall, Alexander carefully observed every detail. For the Macedonians, that vastness was a dangerous sea. For Alexander, it was also a chessboard on which he could move his pieces with precision. The key would be to draw the Persians into motion, break their formation, and, at the right moment, open a gap in the center where Darius himself was positioned. Thus what seemed to be a battlefield chosen to favor a Persian victory ultimately became, in Alexander's hands, an unexpected opportunity. The geography of Gaugamela, carefully prepared to crush him, would be transformed into the stage for the greatest demonstration of military strategy the ancient world had ever witnessed. On the eve of the Battle of Gaugamela, the army that Alexander commanded was far smaller in number compared to the gigantic force assembled by Darius III. Ancient sources indicate that Alexander had approximately 47,000 men, including both infantry and cavalry. Despite this numerical disadvantage, his troops were forged through experience and trained under an almost unbreakable discipline, the result of years of campaigns that demanded endurance, adaptability, and absolute loyalty to their commander. At the heart of his force stood the Macedonian phalangites, organized in long lines and armed with the famous sarissas, extremely long spears that could reach 6 meters in length. These spears formed a wall that was almost impossible to break through when the ranks remained cohesive, giving the army both a solid defense and a powerful offensive weapon. Each man in the phalanx knew his role precisely and trained to move as part of a single organism, capable of rotating, opening, or closing formation with a rhythm that no other army of the period could match. In addition to the phalanx, Alexander relied on light infantry, composed of archers, javelin throwers, and slingers, who harassed and disrupted the enemy before direct contact. There were also the elite infantry troops known as the hypaspists, who protected the flanks of the phalanx and could quickly advance in decisive moments, acting as the link between the main force and the cavalry. The cavalry, however, was Alexander's true offensive arm, and the main factor behind his rapid and decisive victories. The companion cavalry, composed of the Macedonian nobility and always led by Alexander himself, was renowned for its loyalty and its ability to execute bold, high-speed maneuvers. Armed with lances and short swords, these horsemen were used to strike directly at the enemy's weak points, at precisely the right moment, creating panic and breaking through lines that seemed impenetrable. There was also the Thessalian cavalry, positioned on the left flank, tasked with containing Persian advances, while the right wing, personally led by Alexander, sought the decisive strike. This smaller army was, above all, extremely disciplined. Through years of marches, battles, and sieges, each soldier learned to trust one another, and more importantly, to place absolute trust in their commander's judgment. Alexander, in turn, knew many of his men by name, and shared with them the exhaustion, thirst, and danger. This direct and almost personal relationship created a bond that went far beyond military hierarchy. It was a connection built on loyalty and respect. In terms of weaponry, the Macedonians used bronze or reinforced leather armor, helmets, round shields, short swords called xiphos, and of course, the long sarissas. The lighter troops used javelins and slings, while the archers shot from short, quick-firing bows. There were no war chariots or elephants in their contingent, which forced them to compensate for the lack of such resources with strategy and mobility. Another essential factor for the efficiency of this army was tactical organization. Alexander inherited from his father, Philip II, a structure based on flexible units that could adapt to the circumstances of the battle. While the Persians depended on sheer size and force, the Macedonians relied on their speed of response, the ability to open and close formations, and the precision of their movements. Every soldier knew that success depended on keeping formation and obeying orders with accuracy. Therefore, although Alexander had a much smaller contingent than Darius, the quality, experience, and cohesion of this army made it a far more effective war machine. They did not fight merely as individuals. They fought as a single body. This discipline and this trust in their commander would be the key elements that allowed the young king, once again, to challenge an enemy that was overwhelmingly superior in numbers, turning inferiority into opportunity on the battlefield of Gaugamela. If Alexander's army could be described as a compact and disciplined organism, Darius III's army at Gaugamela was the living image of Persian imperial grandeur, a human ocean made up of contingents gathered from the farthest corners of the empire. Accounts from ancient authors such as Arrian and Plutarch speak of staggering figures reaching into the hundreds of thousands of men. Although these estimates are probably exaggerated, there is no doubt that the numerical superiority of the Persians was overwhelming, with a force much larger than the one Alexander had faced at Issus. The core of the Persian army was formed by the traditional Persian infantry, soldiers equipped with bows, short spears, small axes, and large wooden or wicker shields, protected with light armor. This infantry, better suited for large-scale battles and less for compact formations, was tasked with creating a human barrier and wearing down the enemy with a continuous rain of arrows before direct contact. Behind them, a second line of heavy infantry, composed of troops from Media, Babylonia, and Elam, offered additional resistance. However, Darius's greatest advantage was in his cavalry. There were thousands of horsemen from Persia, Bactria, Armenia, Scythia, and other regions. Each contingent had its own style of combat. The Persians preferred heavy cavalry, equipped with long lances and metal armor. The Scythians and Sakas, lighter, relied on speed and skill with mounted archery, firing arrows continuously while circling the enemy. This variety of styles offered the Persian commander dangerous flexibility, as it allowed attacks from multiple angles and the overloading of the enemy's flanks. One of the most feared elements of the Persian army at Gaugamela were the war chariots. Darius assembled around 200 of these vehicles, each one fitted with sharp blades attached to their wheels, designed to cut through enemy infantry, mutilating and spreading panic. These chariots had been prepared specifically for that plain, since they depended on smooth ground to achieve speed and effectiveness. The sight of dozens of them advancing side by side, raising clouds of dust with their spinning blades, was something that inspired terror, even among the most experienced soldiers. In addition, for the first time in a direct confrontation with Alexander, Darius brought war elephants from India, positioning them in the rear as both a psychological and physical reserve. Although they did not play a central role in the battle, their mere presence represented the diversity and reach of Persian power, as they were animals unknown to most of the Greek and Macedonian soldiers. Another important aspect was the ethnic diversity. Present at Gaugamela were men from dozens of nations: Persians, Medes, Parthians, Scythians, Babylonians, Armenians, Egyptians, Arabs, and even Greek mercenaries. This diversity, while being a symbol of imperial power, also posed disadvantages. Not everyone spoke the same language, nor did they have the same training or discipline, and this made precise coordination on such a vast battlefield more difficult. This lack of cohesion contrasted directly with the near-perfect unity of the Macedonian army. Darius positioned his forces in an extensive arc that spanned kilometers in width. The idea was to envelop Alexander from the flanks, wear down his center with relentless attacks, and use the chariots to break through his formations. The chariots would be at the front, followed by the infantry, while the powerful cavalry occupied the wings, ready to execute a full encirclement. In the center, protected by an elite personal guard, stood Darius himself, confident that he would witness the destruction of the invader with his own eyes. The size difference between the two armies was so great that, seen from above, the Persian formation looked like an endless sea, and it was in this sea that Alexander had to find a gap to achieve victory, once again turning an apparently impossible situation into an opportunity. At Gaugamela, Persian numerical superiority seemed insurmountable, but, as the world would discover on that day, numbers alone do not win battles. Long before the first move at Gaugamela, Alexander had already understood that the only way to face an army infinitely larger than his own was to turn the battle into a contest of reasoning rather than brute force. This way of waging war manifested itself not only on the battlefield, but also in preparation, in the constant study of the enemy, and in the flawless use of military intelligence. The campaign that culminated in that final confrontation is a clear example of how he was always 2 steps ahead, anticipating maneuvers and adapting to changes before they even happened. Alexander was never content with what he saw from a distance. His officers deployed a network of spies and scouts who combed the surrounding areas for information. These men observed the size of the Persian camps, counted the campfires at night, estimated the amount of provisions, and even identified where the war chariots were being organized. These reports were brought directly to Alexander, who studied them with patience and used them to create a detailed mental picture of the situation. For him, every detail was a piece on the board, and no piece could be ignored. Another crucial point was his study of the terrain. Alexander knew that in Gaugamela, geography did not favor him. Upon arriving near the Persian field, he spent days analyzing the dimensions of the plain, identifying where he could conduct flanking attacks without being surrounded, and where he could use his speed as an advantage. During this period, there was no haste. This calm deceived many who thought it was hesitation, but in reality it was a precise calculation. He knew that a single opening, created at the right moment, could turn the entire tide of the battle. Meanwhile, Alexander paid close attention to the behavior of the Persian forces at every move. His troops were instructed to maintain flexible formations, able to adapt instantly. This flexibility would be essential when they faced not only a much larger number of soldiers, but also weapons they had rarely encountered before, such as bladed chariots and elephants. He began planning ways to neutralize these threats before they could cause panic. A central element of Alexander's military intelligence was the use of misinformation. He knew Darius expected him to attack head-on and be swallowed up by sheer numbers. By prolonging the approach and appearing to hesitate, he forced Darius to keep thousands of men idle, feeding them and keeping them alert, which created both physical and emotional exhaustion. Thus, even before the first arrow was launched, Alexander had already begun to undermine Persian confidence. On the night before the battle, Alexander surprised everyone. While the vast Persian army spent the night in tension, expecting an attack that never came, he and his men rested. This choice sent a clear message. They were prepared and confident. At dawn, when the sun began to light up the field, Darius saw before him an army that did not appear exhausted or hesitant, but organized, ready, and calm. Based on all the information gathered, Alexander devised a multi-layered strategy. The main idea was simple but brilliant: to use his right wing as bait, advancing diagonally and drawing the Persian cavalry away from the center. Meanwhile, his phalanx would hold the front line cohesive, creating an opening so that, at the right moment, the companion cavalry, led by Alexander himself, could strike directly at the most vulnerable point, the position where Darius himself was stationed. This combination of studying the enemy, controlling his own troops, and boldness in the attack would turn an impossible situation into a victory. Thus, Alexander's military intelligence was not built solely on courage, but on patience and observation. By knowing every detail of his surroundings, he could manipulate the battle as an experienced player manipulates a game board. At Gaugamela, this ability not only saved his army, but destroyed the most powerful empire of the age. The night before the Battle of Gaugamela was one of the most tense in the history of ancient warfare. On the vast plain chosen by Darius III, two completely different realities unfolded under the starry sky of Mesopotamia. On one side, the immense Persian camp stretched out like an entire city, full of fires and activity. On the other, the Macedonian camp, small, compact, and silent, almost motionless in the face of the grand spectacle of the enemy. This contrast in the way they prepared for battle would become a reflection of what would happen the following day. Ancient authors describe the Persian camp as a giant anthill in constant motion. Thousands of fires lit up the plain. The sound of horses and chariots being adjusted echoed throughout the night, and the tension was almost palpable. Darius had gathered a colossal number of soldiers from every corner of the empire, and keeping this mass of men organized and ready for a decisive battle was a challenge in itself. Throughout the night, Persian officers gave orders, positioned chariots, checked weapons, and tried to instill confidence in their men. Yet behind all this restless activity, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. Everyone knew that Alexander had already won impossible battles before, and the shadow of those defeats loomed over the camp. In contrast, the Macedonian camp presented an almost opposite image. Alexander forbade any unnecessary movement during the night. His men were instructed to rest, eat, and sleep, as if nothing extraordinary were about to happen the next day. This calmness even surprised some of his officers, but it was part of the plan. An army that enters battle well-rested holds a psychological advantage over an enemy that has spent the night awake, anxious, and wasting energy. This decision also reflected a striking trait of Alexander's character. He knew how to control not only the actions of the enemy, but also the emotional rhythm of his own soldiers. It is said that during that night, messengers came to Alexander warning him that Darius was preparing a night attack. The young king's response became famous. He told them not to worry, for he did not fear a surprise attack, and trusted his troops so completely that he saw no need for additional watch. That confidence spread through the camp, transforming fear into serenity. For the Macedonians, this was not just another battle. It was the culmination of years of campaigning, and they were ready for anything. While the Persians kept their eyes open, worried about every detail, Alexander, according to accounts, slept deeply, as if he were not about to face the greatest challenge of his life. This attitude impressed even his closest companions, and was interpreted as a sign that he was absolutely certain of victory. The morning of the 1st of October, 331 before Christ, dawned with two armies that had lived through completely opposite nights, one fatigued by tension and expectation, the other renewed by confidence and rest. When the first rays of sunlight illuminated the plain, the difference in the soldiers' expressions was clear. On the Persian side, there was a gigantic army but with tired eyes and tense movements. On the Macedonian side, men who, even though vastly outnumbered, were alert and prepared. The Battle of Gaugamela did not begin with the sound of weapons, but during that silent night, when Alexander's strategic calm silently eroded Darius's advantage. The war was already being won in the mind, before it was won on the field. When the sun began to rise over the horizon of the plain of Gaugamela, the atmosphere was charged with an almost unbearable tension. The night had separated two entirely different worlds, the strategic silence of Alexander and the restless anxiety of Darius. As the golden morning light revealed the vastness of the battlefield, the sheer scale of the coming clash became clear. It was as if the very earth had been transformed into an immense chessboard, with human pieces ready to decide the fate of entire empires. The Persian army was the first to reorganize, taking up an enormous expanse of ground that seemed endless. At the center, protected by a personal guard composed of the so-called immortals and the finest troops of the Persian elite, stood Darius III himself in a richly decorated chariot. This chariot was not just a vehicle, but a symbol of authority and power, placed there so that his men could fight with the certainty that they were being led by the King of Kings. In front of this central core, the war chariots, around 200, were lined up for the first assault. Behind them, a wall of infantry organized by satrapies stood in place, and at the far ends, the powerful cavalry, whose mission was to execute an encircling movement that would crush the Macedonian flanks. On the other side of the plain, the Macedonian army moved with almost mechanical precision. Even with far fewer soldiers, the order and discipline of their formation gave the impression of solidity. Alexander placed his phalanx at the center, each rank of soldiers forming a compact block of sarissas pointing forward, a living, deadly wall. On the right flank, he positioned the companion cavalry, the fastest and most trusted unit, composed of the Macedonian nobility. This side would be the decisive point of the attack, as Alexander planned to break the Persian line with a concentrated strike. On the left flank, he placed the Thessalian cavalry under Parmenian's command, tasked with resisting the overwhelming advance of the Persian cavalry and preventing the Macedonians from being surrounded. Behind the central phalanx, Alexander placed reserves, light infantry, and archers, ready to respond wherever they might be needed. The more flexible units were kept in the rear to contain any attempt at a breakthrough on the sides or to counter the war chariots. The Macedonian formation, though much narrower, had depth and cohesion, a brutal contrast to the Persian breadth. Every space and every position had been chosen to favor quick, unexpected maneuvers. As the sun climbed higher, the metallic gleam of the Persian weapons shone like a sea of fire. The dust raised by horses and chariots was already forming a golden haze, and the sound was a mixture of drums, war cries, and prayers. On the Macedonian side, the atmosphere was entirely different. Absolute silence. Alexander, mounted on his horse Bucephalus, watched the enemy lines intently, waiting for the exact moment to begin the advance. His soldiers did not shout or strike their lances. They simply looked forward, ready to obey. The contrast between the two armies was almost symbolic. On one side, the sheer numbers, grandeur, and confidence of an empire that believed itself invincible. On the other, the precision, calm, and determination of a smaller army that had already proven its ability to defeat far stronger foes. Each Macedonian soldier knew that that morning they were about to face not only an enemy but the weight of history itself. When the sun climbed higher and the dust began to settle, the lines were ready. There was nothing left to adjust. Everything was prepared for a clash that would define the destiny of the known world. The Battle of Gaugamela was about to begin, and in that instant of silence that precedes the storm, the balance between two empires hung on who had more courage and intelligence on the field. When the lines were in position and the silence of dawn became unbearable, the Battle of Gaugamela began. Darius III ordered the advance of his immense war machine, and the entire plain seemed to tremble under the weight of tens of thousands of soldiers and horses. The first wave came with the Persian infantry, but soon the most feared force entered the fray, the charge of the war chariots. Hundreds of vehicles advanced in a straight line, each equipped with sharp blades on their wheels, designed to slice through formations and spread terror. The goal was simple and direct: to open gaps in the Macedonian center, creating a corridor of destruction through which the Persian infantry could enter and crush the phalanx. However, Alexander had already foreseen this maneuver and had prepared his defense with cold precision. Instead of maintaining a rigid line, he ordered his infantry to open small corridors at the exact moment the chariots approached. These openings were created in a calculated way. The soldiers moved aside, keeping their sarissas pointed inward and backward like the teeth of a trap. Thus, the chariots that were supposed to cause panic found themselves surrounded by spears and isolated. As they crossed these gaps, they were attacked from the sides, and the drivers, targeted by javelins and arrows, either lost control or were killed. In just a few moments, the Persians' greatest weapon lost its initial impact. While the chariots were neutralized, the Macedonian infantry maintained its formation with impressive calm. They did not run, they did not break cohesion. Every movement was synchronized. What was supposed to be a massacre turned into a scene of disorder for the Persians. Instead of creating gaps, the chariots became trapped or destroyed, and the fallen horses created obstacles for the Persian advance itself. At this point, the Persian cavalry began a wide movement along the flanks, attempting to execute the encirclement maneuver that Darius had planned. On the Macedonian left, the Thessalian cavalry faced tremendous pressure, for that was precisely the side the Persians aimed to crush in order to open a path to envelop the entire line. On the right side, where Alexander was positioned, the movement was different. He advanced diagonally, slowly moving away from the center, as if he were retreating. This maneuver, seemingly risky, was a lure to draw the Persian cavalry out of position. The initial phase of the battle, therefore, was not offensive for Alexander. He maintained a defensive posture, absorbing the impact of the first advance and allowing the enemy to wear themselves out by trying to use their numerical advantage. While the Persians spent their energy on direct attacks and attempts to break the line, the Macedonian army remained compact, waiting for the exact moment when the Persian structure would begin to fragment. The calm in the center was so striking that even the dust raised by the Persian advance seemed not to disturb the soldiers. They remained motionless, spears raised, shields aligned, enduring the pressure without giving way. This behavior revealed an almost unshakable confidence. They knew that their commander's plan was not to hold out indefinitely, but to open the way for a devastating strike at precisely the right moment. And so, after the failed first wave of chariots and the initial difficulty of the Persian cavalry to find a breach, the battle entered a stage where the tension increased with every passing minute. Darius, confident in the size of his forces, believed that continuous pressure would eventually break the Macedonian formation. Alexander, on the other hand, was about to turn that impeccable defense into the boldest offensive of his entire career. The Persian war chariots were considered one of the most fearsome weapons in the entire East. Designed to break formations, spread panic, and cause both physical and psychological devastation, they were Darius III's main hope of shattering the Macedonian resistance at the very beginning of the battle. Each chariot was pulled by horses trained to run at high speed and fitted with sharp metal blades fixed to the wheels, created to cut down any soldier or horse in their path. On a wide and flat terrain like the plain of Gaugamela, this weapon seemed unstoppable. Darius was betting that with hundreds of them advancing side by side, there would be no line of infantry capable of withstanding the impact. When the order to attack was given, a wave of chariots rushed toward the Macedonian center. The sound of the gallop, combined with the grinding of wheels tearing the ground, created a terrifying effect. The dust raised by the advance covered the horizon, and the scene looked like the herald of a massacre. But what Darius did not expect was that Alexander had already studied this threat and devised a meticulous countermeasure. He knew that facing the chariots head-on would mean being crushed, and that keeping the formation closed would be a deadly trap. Instead, Alexander ordered a tactic that at the time was innovative, creating controlled openings in his own line. When the chariots reached a critical distance, the Macedonian phalanx opened narrow, calculated corridors. This opening looked like a mistake from afar, but it was part of a precise plan. Instead of being destroyed, the soldiers simply gave way, as if channeling the enemy into a funnel. As soon as the chariots entered these corridors, they were immediately attacked from the flanks. The sarissas, the long spears that could reach both drivers and horses, pierced the animals or struck the charioteers, causing many vehicles to overturn or become stuck. Others were targeted by projectiles launched by the peltests, light infantry, stationed behind the lines, ready to eliminate these threats in the confined space. In addition to this intelligent maneuver, Alexander had prepared his infantry to maintain composure. He knew that the greatest danger posed by chariots was psychological. In previous battles, the panic caused by these machines had made entire ranks break before contact was even made. This time, Macedonian discipline was so strict that not a single soldier yielded ground beyond what was necessary to create the passageways. Trust in the commander and the tactic allowed each man to hold firm, even when the sharpened wheels passed just a few feet away. When the first wave of chariots was neutralized in this way, the Persians lost one of the most important trump cards in their plan. Many vehicles were left abandoned in the middle of the field, hindering the very Persian infantry that followed behind. Others crashed into one another amid the chaos. The result was a scene completely opposite to what Darius had envisioned. The chariots that were supposed to clear the way ended up becoming obstacles for his own army. This flawless neutralization of the war chariots marked a psychologically decisive moment in the battle. The Persians realized that their most terrifying weapon had failed, while the Macedonians, strengthened by overcoming this initial danger, grew even more confident. It was proof that discipline and preparation could overcome fear and brute force. Alexander's strategy for dealing with this threat not only saved his central line but also opened the way for the next stage of the battle, where he could finally shift from defense to offense. With the chariot threat eliminated, Alexander now knew he could carry out the next part of his plan, to exploit the imbalance that this failure had caused in the Persian formation. From that moment on, the fight would no longer be just about resistance, but would turn into a calculated movement, aimed at striking at the heart of the enemy. With the war chariots neutralized and the first major threat overcome, Alexander moved to the boldest phase of his strategy at Gaugamela, the feigned maneuver. This move, recorded as one of the most brilliant in military history, consisted of deliberately creating an opening on his right flank to lure the Persian cavalry forward and away from the center, leaving the position of Darius III exposed. While the center of the Macedonian phalanx remained firm, Alexander began to shift his right wing diagonally, advancing laterally toward open ground as if he were attempting to escape the Persian encirclement. This movement, which appeared risky, had two clear objectives: to stretch the Persian front line and to make Darius's cavalry move far from its original position. What seemed like a retreat was, in fact, a calculated invitation for the Persians to follow. The reaction was immediate. Convinced they were about to surround and crush the enemy's right wing, the powerful Persian cavalry launched themselves in pursuit. They believed that Alexander's flank was about to collapse and that this was their golden opportunity to break the Macedonian formation. However, as they advanced, the horsemen began to drift away from the Persian center, creating an invisible gap in what had seemed to be an impenetrable line. Meanwhile, Alexander maintained absolute control over his formation. With every step to the right, he patiently waited for the Persians to move farther from their core. This maneuver stretched and distorted Darius's army structure, transforming a compact line into a vulnerable one. When the distance was sufficient and the pressure in the center eased, Alexander executed the turn. He ordered an angled charge, launching his companion cavalry straight into the opening he had just created. The transition from defense to offense was so sudden that it caught the Persians completely off guard. Until that moment, they believed they were in control of the battle, but in a matter of minutes their central formation began to crumble. This sudden change was the result of a perfect calculation of time and space, where initial patience gave way to an explosion of speed and precision. This maneuver demonstrated a unique quality of Alexander, the ability to turn an apparent weakness into a trap. Any other commander would have limited himself to resisting the encirclement, but he saw in the Persian advance the opportunity to break their structure. By luring the enemy cavalry out of position, he created the ideal conditions to strike the Persian heart with his most loyal and devastating force. It was at this moment that the battle began to turn in favor of the Macedonians. The right wing, now in full assault, became a spearhead advancing directly toward the center where Darius was. Tension on the battlefield mounted as all eyes turned to that unexpected move that would forever change the course of the war. The most emblematic moment of the Battle of Gaugamela came when Alexander, after drawing the Persian cavalry away with his feigned maneuver, finally found the opening he had been planning for all morning. This gap, which had formed right in the center of the Persian formation, stood before him like an open gate to the heart of the enemy army. It was now or never. Without hesitation, Alexander gathered his companion cavalry, the most experienced and loyal men who always fought by his side, and, mounted on Bucephalus, charged at full speed directly toward the center, where he knew Darius III himself was positioned. This movement, fast and violent, was executed at a diagonal angle, completely surprising the Persian troops, who had no time to react or reorganize their ranks. The dust raised by the horses' hooves cut across the plain like a living arrow. The impact of that charge was devastating. Alexander personally led the attack, aiming straight for the spot where Darius's royal chariot stood. With their lances lowered and the companions tightly grouped in formation, the horsemen tore through the Persian center, like a blade slicing through fabric. The violence of the clash not only opened physical space, but also caused an immediate psychological effect. As the Persians saw their king's guard being directly attacked, their lines began to waver. For the Macedonians, this attack was not just an advance, it was a direct strike at the heart of the empire. At that moment, the difference between the two leaders became clear. While Alexander pressed forward at the front line, risking his own life, Darius, despite being protected by an elite personal guard and his royal chariot, began to realize that the situation was slipping out of control. The speed of the assault and the precision with which the Macedonian cavalry carved a path toward him made it clear that he could be surrounded and killed or captured at any moment. The sight of their own king in danger spread panic among the Persian ranks. Alexander, seeing Darius ahead of him, intensified the pressure, closing in more and more. The charge was so precise that, for a brief moment, the possibility of capturing the Persian king became real. However, before the Macedonian guard could reach him, Darius made the decision that would change the outcome of the battle. He turned his chariot around and fled at full speed, abandoning the field. This flight, though it saved his life at that instant, sealed the defeat of the Persian army. The retreat of the king in the middle of battle had a devastating effect on the morale of the Persian troops. Watching their supreme leader flee created a wave of discouragement and chaos. Many soldiers who had been fighting bravely lost their will to continue and began abandoning their positions. At the same time, for the Macedonians, the sight of Darius fleeing was the unmistakable sign that victory was near. It was proof that, even in the face of overwhelming numerical superiority, Alexander's plan had worked. This charge, led by Alexander himself, became one of the most famous maneuvers in military history. It demonstrated not only physical courage, but also strategic genius, the patience to lure the enemy cavalry away, the vision to identify the gap at the exact moment, and the audacity to attack directly at the most protected point of the Persian army. By the end of this assault, the battlefield of Gaugamela was no longer the same. The Persian line was broken, the king had fled, and the fate of an entire empire now hung at the tip of Alexander's spear. When the chariot of Darius III turned in the middle of the battlefield and began to race away, A stunned silence swept through the Persian lines before chaos erupted. In an instant, everything that held that army together, the physical presence of the King of Kings, the symbol of absolute authority, and the promise of overwhelming victory, vanished in a cloud of dust kicked up by the wheels of the royal vehicle. The retreat of Darius was not just an individual act of survival, it was the most devastating psychological blow his men could have suffered at that moment. For the Persian army, accustomed to obeying a centralized command, the flight of the king meant that the battle was lost. Soldiers, even the most experienced, began to ask themselves why they should continue fighting if their own sovereign had abandoned the field. What began as a strategic withdrawal quickly spread like a contagion of panic. In a matter of minutes, entire units broke formation, trying to flee, and the vast line that had once seemed solid turned into a disorganized mass of men and horses running in every direction. From a psychological point of view, this moment was the turning point of the Battle of Gaugamela. Before the flight, the Persians still hoped to contain the Macedonian offensive and reorganize their forces. After it, all resistance became fragmented and chaotic. Even the war chariots and the heaviest infantry, positioned to hold the center, lost their drive. It was as if the entire military structure had been built on the king's physical presence, and once that foundation was gone, the entire edifice collapsed. Ancient accounts describe how the dust raised by Darius's chariot served as a signal for a complete breakdown. The message that spread across miles of battlefront was clear: the king has fled. This perception was more lethal to the Persian army than any physical blow. On the Macedonian side, by contrast, the sight of the flight filled the soldiers with energy. Men who had been fighting, exhausted since the early hours of the day, found new strength, driven by the certainty that they were on the verge of achieving the greatest victory of their lives. Alexander, however, faced with this scenario, made a crucial decision. He could immediately pursue Darius and try to capture him, ending the war once and for all, or he could secure complete victory on the battlefield, ensuring that no part of his army was overwhelmed by the contingents that were still fighting. He chose the second option. By doing so, he left the direct pursuit for later and focused on consolidating control of the plain. This choice demonstrated not only his composure, but also his understanding that victory was not just about capturing one man, but about destroying the military power that sustained an entire empire. Meanwhile, the flight of Darius became a symbol of disgrace among the Persians themselves. The king, by abandoning his men, lost not only the battle, but also the respect of many governors and satrapies who began to consider his position untenable. Gaugamela did not just destroy an army, it destroyed the image of Persia's invincibility, and with it opened the doors to the definitive collapse of the empire. That scene, the king fleeing and leaving behind a sea of chaos, would be remembered for centuries as the moment when Persia's fortunes changed forever. And for Alexander, it was proof that discipline and strategy could subdue countless numbers, transforming a small, cohesive force into something capable of dismantling the greatest power of the ancient world. When Darius's chariot disappeared over the horizon, and the news of his flight spread across the field of Gaugamela, many expected Alexander to launch his cavalry immediately in pursuit of the Persian king. Capturing Darius at that moment could have ended the war instantly and definitively. However, the young Macedonian king, even faced with an apparently unique opportunity, made a decision that at first seemed to restrain boldness, but revealed a far deeper strategic understanding. He chose not to abandon the battle to chase the fleeing enemy. This choice, far from an act of hesitation, was a cold calculation that once again demonstrated his broad vision and discipline as a commander. The flight of Darius, although a clear symbol of defeat, did not mean that the entire Persian army had been overcome. At that moment, thousands of men were still fighting across the plain, especially on the wings where Macedonian pressure was less intense. On the left flank, commanded by Parmenion, the Thessalian cavalry was engaged in a fierce struggle against a much larger Persian contingent and was at serious risk of being overwhelmed if Alexander abandoned the central position to pursue the king. If the Persian cavalry managed to break through that flank, they could encircle the Macedonian rear and turn an almost certain victory into disaster. That risk was far too great to ignore. Moreover, Alexander knew that capturing a king in flight amid the chaos was not as simple as it seemed. Darius was not alone. Even as he fled, he was protected by an elite guard who would do everything possible to prevent his capture. Charging blindly with his cavalry in pursuit could lead to dangerous separation from the main army, expose Alexander's companions to ambush, and completely disorganize the formation. Such a mistake could cost far more than allowing the king to escape for the time being. Thus Alexander chose to consolidate what he had already gained. To ensure that the field of Gaugamela was completely secured, he quickly reorganized his lines, reinforced Parmenion on the left, and coordinated attacks to eliminate the pockets of Persian resistance still fighting fiercely. His priority at that moment was to turn the moral victory, already achieved with the king's flight, into an absolute military victory, destroying the enemy's capacity to continue fighting. This decision proved correct. Instead of a reckless advance, Alexander opted for a methodical and irreversible victory. By the time the sun began to sink in the sky, the plain of Gaugamela was completely under Macedonian control. Persian losses were immense, while Alexander's army remained cohesive and ready for the next stages of the campaign. Only after ensuring that no part of his army was in danger did Alexander begin the pursuit. Darius managed to escape on that occasion, fleeing deep into the empire, but his flight had disastrous consequences for his authority. The satrapy's confidence in his leadership began to crumble, and many regions chose to surrender to Alexander rather than continue supporting a defeated king. Thus, even without capturing Darius that day, Alexander achieved something even greater. He destroyed the backbone of the Persian army and left the throne of a vast empire without military or moral support. This choice, not to follow the emotion of the moment, but to keep a cold and strategic mind, is one of the greatest examples of what made Alexander such a different kind of leader from other conquerors. For him, victory was not an act of impulse, but a carefully constructed plan, where every step led to a greater outcome. At Gaugamela, this meant giving up immediate glory to secure total victory. By the end of the day at Gaugamela, when the dust raised by the horses began to settle, and the plain once again revealed the outlines of a devastated battlefield, the magnitude of the human tragedy became evident. The battle had been fierce, long, and marked by direct clashes at several points, but the disproportion between the losses on one side and the other was so great that it became further proof of Alexander's strategic genius. Despite the overwhelming force assembled by Darius III, the Persian losses were enormous, while the Macedonians suffered relatively small casualties. Ancient accounts, such as those of Arrian and Plutarch, describe staggering numbers. There are estimates that speak of tens of thousands of Persian dead, with figures ranging from 40 to more than 100,000 soldiers killed during and after the battle. This variation exists because, in the chaos of the flight, many soldiers were cut down during the pursuit, and the count was lost in the immensity of the field. Even so, there is no doubt that the number was catastrophic for the Persian army. Infantrymen, cavalrymen, and even charioteers were annihilated, while many thousands more scattered and abandoned the fight. The forces of Darius were not only defeated, they were destroyed in their cohesion. Many of the deaths occurred not in the initial clash, but in the phase when, after the king's flight, the Persian line collapsed and each soldier tried to escape on his own. The lack of discipline turned the retreat into a massacre. The abandoned chariots and the bodies scattered across the plain created a landscape of devastation that would serve as a warning to anyone still thinking of resisting Alexander's advance. On the Macedonian side, the difference was overwhelming. Losses were much smaller, amounting to a few hundred dead according to most ancient sources. This was due to several factors: the compact formation of the phalanx, the efficient neutralization of the chariots, the discipline during the initial defense, and, above all, the perfect execution of the charge that shattered the Persian center. While the Persians relied on numbers, Alexander used quality and precision to prevent his men from being exposed to chaotic open-field fighting. Even so, every life lost on the Macedonian side was deeply felt. Alexander was known for recognizing his fallen soldiers by name and for rewarding their families, reinforcing the bond of loyalty that the army had with him. This practice strengthened morale and cohesion within the group, something vital for campaigns of such length. Beyond the direct human losses, it is important to note the impact that the battle had on the fighting capacity of the Persian Empire. By losing so many men, especially the most experienced and the elite forces, Darius saw his military power crumble. He could try to gather new contingents, but he would never again be able to match the training and experience that had been destroyed in a single day. The comparison of casualties clearly shows the contrast between the two armies. While the Persian field became a cemetery, the Macedonians remained standing, exhausted, but intact enough to continue their march. This victory, achieved with minimal losses for Alexander, cemented his reputation as one of the greatest strategists in history, for he not only defeated a colossal force, but did so while preserving as much as possible the men who were most precious to him, those who carried in their shields and spears the destiny of his ambition. With the field of Gaugamela taken, and the Persian army completely destroyed as an organized force, the gates of the empire of Darius III were left wide open to Alexander. The flight of the Persian king created such a power vacuum that in just a few weeks, some of the most important cities of the ancient world began to welcome the young conqueror not as an invading enemy, but as their new legitimate lord. No immediate consequence of the battle was as symbolic and strategic as the surrender of Babylon, the largest and richest city of the East at that time. When Alexander entered Babylon, he was received with acclamations and ceremonies, as if he were taking possession of a throne that already belonged to him. The city, the economic and cultural center of the Persian Empire, was protected by immense walls and famous for its hanging gardens, but its rulers understood that resistance would be useless. They opened the gates, offered gifts, and swore loyalty to the Macedonian conqueror. This gesture not only delivered to Alexander one of the world's greatest fortresses without a fight, but also provided him with immediate access to enormous resources. Treasures accumulated over centuries of Persian rule, stocked arsenals, as well as granaries and commercial routes now under his control. Soon after Babylon, other key cities fell one by one. Susa, with its famous palace and enormous wealth, and later Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia. Each surrendered city meant a deeper blow to Darius's authority and more power in Alexander's hands. The Persian army, which had fled in disarray, had neither the time nor the conditions to reorganize. The speed of the Macedonian marches was relentless, and the reputation of the conquering king grew at every step, spreading fear and resignation throughout the territory. The collapse of Persian power was not limited to the military aspect. The morale of the empire dissolved almost instantly. Entire satrapies began to defect, offering their support to Alexander in exchange for retaining their local privileges. Governors and nobles understood that the Persian king could no longer protect his domains, and that the best choice for their survival was to swear loyalty to the new conqueror. In less than a year after Gaugamela, the political structure built by Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius I was in ruins. Alexander's victory did not represent merely a territorial conquest. It marked the beginning of a profound cultural transformation. With the fall of these cities, he gained direct access to the libraries, treasures, and traditions of Persia, and began to adopt practices that integrated Greek and Persian elements into his way of governing. This fusion of cultures would become the basis of Hellenism, a phenomenon that spread throughout the Middle East and Asia, leaving a profound mark for centuries. From a strategic perspective, the fall of Babylon also meant control over vital routes for trade and for the mobilization of armies. Alexander consolidated a secure position in the center of the empire and secured almost unlimited supplies to continue his advance. From that moment on, the war ceased to be defensive and became a systematic advance to the very end of Persian territory. For Darius, Gaugamela represented more than a defeat. It was the beginning of the end. Fleeing into the interior, he would never again be able to gather an army like the one he had lost. The Persian central power had been crushed, and what remained was nothing more than a series of desperate attempts to reorganize, all doomed to failure in the face of Alexander's speed and determination. Thus, in just a few weeks after Gaugamela, a new balance of power emerged in the ancient world. What had once been called the Persian Empire began to be replaced by a new order, that of Alexander, the young Macedonian king who had challenged and defeated the greatest empire on earth. After the victory at Gaugamela, Alexander entered the very heart of the Persian Empire and found a wealth so immense that it seemed impossible to measure. What for centuries had been accumulated by the great Persian kings, gold, silver, precious stones, luxury objects, tapestries, ornate weapons, and works of art, was now under the control of the young Macedonian. The campaign that had begun as a bold endeavor to avenge the old Persian invasions ended up turning Alexander into the absolute master of the East, owner of a treasure that the world had never before seen gathered in one place. In Babylon and Susa, the royal storehouses were overflowing. According to ancient chroniclers, in Susa alone, Alexander found tens of thousands of talents of pure silver and minted gold, as well as luxurious furniture, coffers full of coins, and jewels that symbolized Persian power and opulence. These resources were immediately converted into military strength. With this gold, Alexander was able to pay his army, hire new contingents, strengthen his infrastructure, and finance the continuation of the campaign all the way to the edges of Asia. But the most symbolic act of all came when Alexander reached Persepolis, the architectural jewel of the Persian Empire. Persepolis was more than a city. It was a ceremonial center, a symbol of pride and Eastern supremacy. By conquering Persepolis, Alexander sent the world a clear message. Persian dominance had ended. For a few months he respected the splendor of the city, but later, in an act charged with political and psychological meaning, the city was looted and then set on fire. The burning of Persepolis was interpreted by many as revenge for the destruction the Persians had inflicted on Athens and Greece during the Persian Wars. This event marked the definitive end of symbolic Persian resistance. Everything that represented the glory of that empire now burned in flames. Through these actions, Alexander not only destroyed Persian power, but also appropriated its legacy. He began to use part of the resources and administrative structure left behind by the Persians to consolidate an even greater and more efficient empire. The satrapies were reorganized. Persian nobles who swore loyalty were kept in administrative posts, and gradually Alexander began to adopt some Eastern customs, creating a fusion between the Greek West and the Persian East. The seizure of these treasures was not an act of mere plunder. Alexander was calculating. The gold and silver collected would keep his war machine running for years and would allow him to continue his march without depending solely on resources from Macedonia. This economic power ensured that the young king could march all the way to India without lacking anything, not provisions, not weapons, not soldiers. With Gaugamela and the capture of the great cities, Alexander became the master of the East. The Persian resistance that remained was fragmented, and Darius, fleeing to the east, no longer had the power or prestige to gather a new army. From that moment on, the empire that for centuries had dominated half the known world ceased to exist as an independent power. In its place, a new empire was born, one that united two worlds, an empire that in just a few years would transform the culture and politics of all Asia and leave a legacy that would endure for centuries. With these riches under his control and Persian pride destroyed, Alexander now had everything he needed to continue his march. But his ambition went far beyond military victory. He wanted to become not just a conqueror, but a king capable of uniting civilizations. And the destruction of the old empire was only the first step in an even grander project. The accounts of the Battle of Gaugamela have reached us through chroniclers and historians of antiquity, who centuries after the confrontation recorded this episode as one of the most impressive military feats in history. The absence of direct contemporary records meant that the narrative was built from later testimonies, but all of them agree on one point. Gaugamela was not just a battle, it was proof of Alexander's strategic superiority over an enemy far more numerous. Among the most important authors is Arian from the 2nd century after Christ, whose work Anabasis of Alexander is considered one of the most reliable sources on the conqueror's campaign. Arian describes the battle in rich detail, highlighting the discipline of the Macedonians, Alexander's ability to remain calm in the face of the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Persians, and the perfection of the maneuver that disrupted the enemy's center. He emphasizes that Alexander was able to turn an almost suicidal situation into a decisive victory because he managed to control the rhythm of the battle from the very beginning. Plutarch, another essential author in his work, Life of Alexander, also dedicates a large section to Gaugamela. His account is more literary and moralizing, but no less impactful. Plutarch focuses on Alexander's personal behavior, narrating episodes such as his tranquility on the night before the battle, the confidence with which he slept while Darius kept his men awake, and the way he personally led the decisive charge against the Persian center. For him, Gaugamela is the perfect demonstration of how the leadership of a single man can change the destiny of entire peoples. Other authors, such as Diodorus of Sicily, Quintus Curtius Rufus, Camicus, and Justin Schills, also recorded the event, each adding different layers to the narrative. All of them agree, however, on a fundamental point. The battle showed that the quality of an army, combined with the genius of its commander, could overcome colossal numbers. These accounts also highlight the psychological collapse caused by Darius's flight among his own troops, turning a battle that was initially balanced into an overwhelming victory for the Macedonians. Despite some exaggerations common to ancient historiography, such as inflated figures for the number of Persian soldiers or the almost mythical heroism attributed to Alexander, the essence of what happened at Gaugamela is clear. Ancient historians saw in this confrontation a turning point in history, an event that sealed the fall of the greatest Eastern Empire and opened the way for the spread of Hellenic culture into regions that until then had never been under Western rule. The analysis of these authors is also a portrait of the admiration Alexander inspired over the centuries. Gaugamela is not only studied as a military victory, but also as a lesson in strategy, discipline, and leadership. These texts have crossed millennia because, for the ancients, Alexander did not just win a battle, he redefined the limits of what was possible for a human commander. The Battle of Gaugamela was not recorded only as a decisive victory for Alexander, but also as a laboratory of military tactics that would forever change the way war was understood and fought in the ancient world. It was there that the idea was consolidated that strategic intelligence, flexibility, and understanding of the terrain could be more powerful than sheer numerical superiority. Several innovations applied that day were so remarkable that they continued to influence armies for centuries afterward. The first great innovation was the mobility of the phalanx combined with the cavalry. Until then, the Macedonian phalanx was considered an essentially static formation, an impenetrable barrier that advanced slowly. Alexander, however, proved that if coordinated with precision, it could be dynamic. He used the phalanx as a pivot, keeping the center solid while moving his wings with elasticity, creating angles and openings that surprised the Persians. This creative use of the phalanx, not only as a defense but as part of a moving mechanism, was unprecedented. Another innovative aspect was the feigned maneuver or advance into the void that Alexander used on the right flank. By moving his troops diagonally, he not only avoided encirclement, but also lured the enemy cavalry away from its original position. This technique, now known as lure and break, became studied as a perfect example of manipulating the enemy on the battlefield. This maneuver demonstrated that creating an apparent weakness can be as effective as direct force, as long as timing and calculation are precise. In addition, the neutralization of the Persian war chariots was a landmark in tactical adaptation. While other armies would have panicked in the face of this shock weapon, Alexander trained his men to open controlled corridors and destroy the threat at the exact moment. This idea of absorbing and neutralizing an attack, rather than confronting it head-on, would, centuries later, inspire other military strategies designed to counter weapons once considered invincible. Another point that deserves attention is the capacity for real-time command. Alexander did not direct the battle from afar. He was on the front lines, personally leading the charge that broke the Persian center. This closeness to his soldiers allowed for quick adjustments and instant decisions, turning a battle that could have been chaotic into a sequence of precisely coordinated movements. These innovations had an immediate and lasting impact. Immediately after Gaugamela, many peoples realized that numbers alone were not enough. Over the centuries, Roman generals and even modern commanders studied the principles applied by Alexander in this confrontation: discipline, flexibility, and psychological insight into the enemy. The battle became a classic example of how a smaller army, if well trained and intelligently led, can overcome much larger forces. Gaugamela, therefore, was not just a victory. It was a living manual of strategies and creative solutions that redefined the art of war. The techniques employed there have crossed millennia as lessons in military planning, demonstrating that victory depends less on brute force and more on the ability to think, adapt, and act at the exact moment. The victory at Gaugamela was not only a military milestone, it triggered a profound cultural transformation that would shape the history of the ancient world for centuries. By definitively defeating the Persian Empire, Alexander opened the doors to an unprecedented fusion between the Greek world and the Eastern civilizations. This interaction gave rise to what historians call the Hellenistic period, an era in which ideas, customs, languages, religions, and technologies circulated as never before, creating a cultural mosaic that redefined the identity of vast regions. With the conquest of Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and later all the Persian satrapies, Alexander did not limit himself to imposing Greek culture on the conquered territories. On the contrary, he deliberately promoted an exchange between Greeks and Easterners. He adopted certain Persian customs, encouraged mixed marriages between his officers and Persian women, and founded dozens of cities, many named after himself, Alexandria, that functioned as cultural diffusion centers. In these cities, Greek theaters coexisted with Eastern temples, Persian markets received merchants from the Mediterranean, and schools taught both Greek philosophy and scientific knowledge originating from Mesopotamia and Egypt. Greek became the common language in regions that previously used Persian, Aramaic, or other local tongues. This linguistic unification facilitated trade, diplomacy, and the circulation of knowledge. At the same time, Alexander incorporated into his government administrative elements from Persia, such as the satrapy system, which continued to operate, but now under a more cosmopolitan vision. This balance between local tradition and Hellenistic innovation made his rule more acceptable to many peoples. Culturally, the contact between these two worlds produced significant advances in areas such as astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Libraries and study centers began to gather Greek and Eastern texts, preserving and expanding the available knowledge. The famous Library of Alexandria, later founded in Egypt, would become a symbol of this movement, bringing together knowledge from every part of the empire. Religiously, there was also a great impact. Greek gods began to be associated with local deities, creating religious syncretism that gave rise to mixed cults. This spiritual blending not only expanded forms of worship, but also strengthened the idea that different peoples could share beliefs and common values. This same principle extended to art. Greek sculptures and paintings began to incorporate decorative elements and Eastern styles, creating new aesthetic forms that spread throughout Asia and the Mediterranean. This movement of cultural integration that began after Gaugamela created something unprecedented, an awareness of a connected world. Until then, each people lived isolated in their traditions and boundaries. With Alexander's conquests, the limits between East and West began to blur. This constant exchange of ideas and techniques laid the foundations for a more interdependent and cosmopolitan world, where knowledge and culture no longer belonged to a single people, but became the heritage of all. Therefore, the cultural legacy of Gaugamela was as enduring as its military importance. The battle did not only topple an empire, it inaugurated a new era of human interaction, where the power of arms gave way to the power of ideas. The Hellenism born from this meeting of worlds would continue to influence kingdoms, cities, and societies for centuries, leaving a legacy that can still be perceived today at the foundations of both Western and Eastern civilizations. After the victory at Gaugamela and the collapse of the Persian Empire, Alexander did not simply assume control of the conquered territories as a foreign conqueror. Instead, he initiated one of the deepest cultural and political processes of antiquity, the fusion between Greek and Persian traditions. This movement, which began as a strategy of governance to consolidate his power, eventually created a new standard of coexistence that forever changed the history of both the East and the West. Upon entering the Persian cities, Alexander did not destroy everything he found. On the contrary, he preserved the administrative structure created by the great Achaemenid kings, maintaining the satrapies and allowing many local governors to remain in their positions as long as they swore loyalty to him. This policy proved wise because, at the same time that it avoided immediate revolts, it earned the respect of peoples accustomed to centuries of their own traditions. Unlike other conquerors who imposed radical changes, Alexander sought cooperation, realizing that Persian culture possessed a richness and organization that could strengthen his imperial project. One of the most visible elements of this fusion was the adoption of Persian customs by the Macedonian court itself. On some occasions, Alexander began to wear Persian clothing, participated in Eastern ceremonies, and incorporated close advisors and Persian nobles into his inner circle. This gesture, far from being an act of submission, was a conscious strategy to show the conquered peoples that the new ruler was not merely an invader, but a leader willing to unite traditions. His famous decision to promote mixed marriages, such as the great event in Susa, where hundreds of Macedonian officers married Persian women, symbolized this project of integration. The cities founded by Alexander were another powerful tool of this fusion. These cities, which became known as Alexandrias, scattered from Egypt to the borders of India, functioned as meeting points for cultures. There, both Greek and Persian were spoken, markets offered products from both the East and the Mediterranean, and schools and temples combined different architectural styles. These new metropolises became the perfect stage for the rise of a cosmopolitan society in which merchants, philosophers, artists, and soldiers from different origins lived together. From a military and administrative perspective, Alexander incorporated Persian soldiers into his army and taught Greek techniques to his Eastern allies, creating a multicultural army capable of operating in very diverse regions. This not only increased his combat capability, but also blurred the barriers that separated Greeks and Persians, creating a common identity based on loyalty to the new empire. This fusion, however, did not occur without resistance. Many traditional Macedonians viewed these measures with suspicion, believing that their king was becoming too orientalized. On the other hand, some Persians resisted accepting Greek customs. Even so, Alexander's project was greater than these tensions. He believed that the true strength of the empire lay in unity, not division. For this reason, he continued to encourage the mixing of ideas, practices, and people until the end of his life. Over time, this blending of worlds consolidated into what we know as Hellenism, an era in which the Greek legacy and Eastern tradition were mixed in almost every aspect of life: politics, economy, art, religion, and science. The impact of this encounter was so great that even after Alexander's death, the Hellenistic kingdoms continued to prosper with this combination of cultures. Thus, Gaugamela not only overthrew an empire, but also gave rise to a new model of civilization. For the first time in history, East and West began to speak a common language, not just a tongue, but a shared vision of the world that would shape the destinies of entire peoples for centuries. Behind the grandeur of Gaugamela and the fame of Alexander and Darius III, there are lesser-known accounts that reveal the human and unexpected dimension of this battle. These curious details, often overlooked in major analyses, help explain how the Macedonian victory was built, not only on numbers and strategies, but also on decisions, characters, and singular events that marked history. One remarkable curiosity involves Alexander's dream on the night before the battle. Writers of antiquity, such as Plutarch, report that Alexander slept deeply and dreamed of a sacred figure, a kind of symbol of victory, assuring him that Gaugamela would be the stage of his consecration. This episode was interpreted by the soldiers as a sign that the gods were on the young king's side, further strengthening the army's confidence. Another little-known point is the importance of Parmenion, Alexander's most experienced general, who commanded the left flank during the battle. While Alexander executed his bold maneuver on the right flank, Parmenion held off immense pressure, preventing the Persian cavalry from breaking through that part of the line. Records indicate that at a certain moment he sent messengers asking for help, but Alexander did not deviate from the plan, trusting that Parmenion would manage to hold his ground. This balance between boldness and trust in his commanders was decisive in ensuring that the plan worked without collapsing. Little is said as well about the squires and common soldiers, whose role in neutralizing the Persian chariots was crucial. These men, trained not to lose their composure, opened the corridors that dismantled the initial Persian attack. Without such discipline, the entire strategy could have been compromised at the very beginning. Many died anonymously there, but it was they who turned the first line of defense into an impenetrable wall. A curious detail about the Persian war horses is that during the chaos, many were frightened by the spears and the deafening noise of battle, making the chariots dangerous even for the army that used them. Numerical superiority, at many moments, turned against the Persians because the dust and confusion created an environment where their own resources became obstacles. There are also records of the way Alexander used the terrain almost invisibly. Although the plain had been prepared by Darius to be flat and perfect, Alexander exploited small undulations and differences in the soil to move his troops in a more protected way, using these almost imperceptible irregularities as natural barriers against fast assaults. This type of observation, which only an extremely attentive commander could notice, was one of the keys to the success of his diagonal maneuver. Among the less remembered characters were the scouts and local informants who, throughout the campaign, provided crucial information about the size and positioning of the Persian army. Thanks to them, Alexander knew exactly where to attack, how many chariots he would face, and how to respond to the enemy's deployment. Finally, there is a political curiosity that few mention. After the battle, some of the captured Persian nobles were treated with respect and invited by Alexander to join his army. This unexpected gesture reinforced his policy of cultural fusion and ensured that former enemies became allies in the later expansion of his empire. These small stories, seemingly secondary, show that Gaugamela was not just the battle of great names. It was an event where every decision, every detail, and every soldier contributed to the outcome of a confrontation that, centuries later, still resonates as an example of planning and courage. After the victory at Gaugamela, Alexander's fame spread so quickly that the battle ceased to be merely a military episode and became surrounded by legendary stories, often exaggerated or romanticized, that endured for generations. These accounts, created both by admirers and by conquered peoples, transformed the confrontation into something larger than a simple historical event, consolidating Alexander's image as an almost superhuman commander. One of the most recurring legends concerns Alexander's almost divine figure in the battle. According to later accounts, at the moment of the decisive charge against the Persian center, some soldiers swore they saw a glow around the young king, as if he were protected by the gods. This vision was interpreted as a clear sign that he was not fighting alone, but under the protection of Zeus, Athena, or Hercules, mythological figures he himself believed to be part of his lineage. Another legendary story tells that Bucephalus, Alexander's horse, charged at the Persians with such courage and speed that it seemed to understand what was at stake. The almost symbiotic relationship between the commander and his horse became a theme for stories that went beyond the military field, turning Bucephalus into a symbol of loyalty. Even centuries later, the image of Alexander mounted on Bucephalus in the Gaugamela charge was portrayed as a scene of pure invincibility. There were also exaggerated accounts about the size of the Persian army, which in some versions was said to be more than 1 million men. This hyperbole served to exalt even more the Macedonian victory, presenting it as an impossible feat. The greater the number attributed to the Persians, the greater the glory of having won with such inferior forces. Myths about omens also emerged. Some writers claimed that on the night before the battle, celestial signs appeared, shooting stars, mysterious rumblings, or sudden winds that were interpreted as omens of Macedonian victory. These supernatural elements helped build Alexander's image as a man chosen by the gods to change the course of the world. Over time, the battle also came to be seen as an almost didactic example of military genius. Roman generals and later commanders used Gaugamela as a reference in military academies, and this created a cultural effect. The battle began to be told and retold in an increasingly epic tone. Alexander's maneuvers were described as if they were perfect chess moves, and his calmness in the face of overwhelming enemy numbers was praised as something that only an inspired commander could display. In addition, some popular versions even attributed fantastical events to the battle, such as the idea that Darius was saved by a storm sent by the gods, or that spirits guided Alexander through the dust of the battlefield. These narrative embellishments, though far from reality, helped turn Gaugamela's victory into myth, cementing its importance in collective memory. Thus, more than a struggle for military supremacy, Gaugamela became a universal symbol of intelligence, courage, and destiny. Even today, it is impossible to speak of the great battles of history without mentioning this moment in which the skill of a commander changed not only the course of a war, but also the way war itself would be remembered forever. The Battle of Gaugamela, fought on the 1st of October in the year 331 before Christ, was not just a clash between two armies. It was a turning point that redefined the political, cultural, and military history of the ancient world. What happened on that Mesopotamian plain transcended the logic of numbers and brute strength. Faced with an overwhelmingly larger enemy, Alexander demonstrated that discipline, preparation, and strategic vision were capable of overcoming any apparent disadvantage. The victory achieved there sealed the fall of the greatest empire of that time, Persia, and transformed a young Macedonian king into the master of the East. Gaugamela is considered one of the greatest victories in history for several reasons. First, because of the contrast between the two sides. On one side, the Persian colossus, with an army made up of tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of men, supported by war chariots and elephants, and backed by virtually unlimited resources. On the other, a smaller Macedonian force, disciplined but exhausted after years of campaigning. This disparity made Alexander's victory seem impossible, which only magnifies the scale of his achievement. Second, because of the flawless execution of strategy. Alexander transformed the battlefield into a chessboard, using every move of the enemy to his advantage. From the neutralization of the Persian chariots, to the false retreat that lured the enemy cavalry away, and finally to the decisive charge against the center where Darius stood, every step was calculated with precision. There was no improvisation or luck. Everything was the result of planning, courage, and the ability to adapt to circumstances at the exact right moment. Another reason Gaugamela is a landmark is because of its direct consequences on the global stage. The Persian defeat opened the gates for the fall of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, destroying an empire that had dominated the East for over 2 centuries. Within a few months, Alexander came to control most of the known world and initiated a new cultural era, marked by the fusion of Greek and Eastern traditions, which we know as Hellenism. In other words, Gaugamela not only decided a war, but changed the political and cultural face of an entire continent. Furthermore, the battle is remembered as an eternal example of leadership. Alexander did not command from a distance. He led from the front, personally leading the decisive charge and sharing the risks of his men. His presence inspired confidence and courage, turning the morale of his army into a weapon as lethal as their spears and horses. This approach created absolute loyalty that was reflected in every movement on the field. Lastly, the symbolic impact of Gaugamela is immeasurable. Since antiquity, it has been studied in military academies as a lesson in tactics and command. At the same time, the battle gave rise to legends and myths that reinforced the image of Alexander as someone destined for great deeds, almost beyond human limits. In a single day, the balance of power in the world changed forever. Gaugamela, therefore, is remembered not just as a victory, but as a masterclass in intelligence, planning, and leadership. A supreme example of how the determination and vision of a single man can alter the destiny of entire civilizations. By the end of that afternoon, under a sky stained with dust and the blood of battle, a new chapter in history had begun. The chapter in which Alexander the Great truly became the conqueror of the world.